Hello class, this is Accounting 2301. Today we're going to be looking at some in-class exercises from Chapter 8. Chapter 8 has to do with absorption costing versus variable costing. And if you remember back to the chapter, when we use absorption costing, we include all manufacturing costs in the product cost. That includes the fixed overhead as well as all direct materials, direct labor, and variable overhead. When we start thinking about variable costing, we assign only the variable manufacturing costs to the product, and the fixed overhead is then treated as a period cost. So let's take a look at some of the problems. The first exercise here gives us some information about Fairchild Company, tells us some data associated with products that we're making. So up top, we're told about the inventory, units produced and units sold. We're also given some variable costs and also some fixed cost. And if we look down to what the question is asking for, we're first going to use absorption costing in problem A right here. And then in problem B, we'll calculate using variable costing, so we can start to see the differences between these two methods. So let's jump right in. The first item we'll be looking at is the ending inventory balance. And we first want to go ahead and see how many units are in our ending inventory. That's not given in the problem. So we can take a calculation. We know that we produced 11,000 units. We know that we sold only 7,000 of those. We didn't have any beginning inventory. So produced minus sold, we know that we have 4,000 units available in our ending inventory. We also want to go ahead and, in step 2 here, calculate the absorption cost per unit. And we know that this includes both the variable and the fixed costs. So that's going to include all the variable costs here, which if we add up 100 plus 100 plus 50, we see that it's $250 per unit. And then we'll also include in there the $100 fixed overhead per unit. So we can see that the absorption cost per unit is $350. So thinking about our ending inventory value, we can multiply the number of units, which is 4,000, times that $350 absorption rate per unit. And we see that our ending inventory balance is 1.4 million in this case. We can also think about the cost of goods sold. So in this case, we want to actually look back up and remember that 7,000 units were actually sold. We've already calculated that absorption cost per unit. So we can multiply out number of units sold times that 350, and the cost of goods sold in this case for absorption costing is 2.45 million. Next up, we'll go ahead and take a look at the operating income. And if you'd like a more detailed, nicely laid out example, you can see Cornerstone 8-3 in the textbook chapter. It may provide a nicer just layout compared to the handwritten solution here. But we do know that if we're thinking about our operating income for the absorption costing, we're going to have our sales minus the cost of goods sold minus the selling and administrative expenses. So first off, we can calculate our sales. We know from before that we sold 7,000 units. See if we can get rid of this message here. All right, so we know that there's 7,000 units sold. And if we look back up to the problem, the units here are $500 per unit when we sell them. So if we make that multiplication, we can see that the cash coming into the company was 3.5 million for those units sold. From here, we have the rest of the pieces of the puzzle to just fill in this top equation here for operating income. So we bring down the sales, 3.5 million. The cost of goods sold that we calculated above here. And the selling and administrative expenses, if we go back up, we can just grab that right out of the problem that's given. And we see that for absorption costing, the operating income is $850,000. Next up, we can move to our variable costing. And we know that this method assigns only the manufacturing costs to the actual product. And the fixed overhead in this case is going to be treated as a period cost. So we can take a look at this different method, kind of see how it contrasts to the absorption costing from above. So just like above, we'll first calculate the ending inventory balance. And we already calculated out. Up here we know that there's 4,000 units in the ending inventory. But in this case, we're just going to use the $250 variable unit product cost. We're not going to pitch in that extra $100 that is included in the fixed overhead like we did above. So we can see the multiplication here that our ending inventory balance is 1 million, whereas above it was 1.4 million. Second, we'll take a look at the cost of goods sold. And again, we're just using the variable unit product cost. From above, we know that we sold 7,000 units. So we make that multiplication, and our cost of goods sold is 1.75 million. If we look back above in problem A here, using absorption costing, the cost of goods sold was 2.45 million. So you can see how that disparity starts to play out. Next, we'll take a look at the operating income. And in this case, if we're thinking about variable costing, this equation is going to include our sales minus the variable cost of goods sold. That will give us a contribution margin. And from there, we subtract out the fixed expenses to arrive at the total operating income. So some of these items we have already calculated. We have the sales up here from A3. So regardless of which method we're using, we still know that we've sold 7,000 units, and they sold for $500 a piece. So that gives us our 3.5 million here in this equation. The variable cost of goods sold we just calculated. Grab that from above, it's 1.75 million. So we can make that subtraction. And we see that our contribution margin is 1.75 million. From here, we subtract out the fixed expenses. So if we look back up to the problem, we've got our fixed costs here. So we have $100 in fixed overhead per unit. We know that we produced 11,000 units. So that calculation gives us our 1.1 million. And then we also have the selling and administrative expenses of 200,000. So again, just looking back down to the problem, we just plug in these values to subtract out our fixed expenses. And we see that our operating income is 450,000 using the variable costing versus the 850,000 that we had using absorption costing.